Hello and welcome to the Shifting the Paradigm webinar series, where we build community knowledge, skills, confidence and understanding of child sexual exploitation. We hope that you find this webinar beneficial.
Everyone for coming along today. I'm joining you today from Bidjigal Land here on the New South Wales coast, and just to extend my respects to elders past and present, and to extend that respect and acknowledgement to any First Nations people that might be joining us today. I'm really pleased to have the chance to share with you the emerging findings of the world's largest perpetration prevalence study that we conducted a couple of years ago. Most of what we know about the prevalence of child sexual abuse is based on victimization studies, where we ask adults about what happened to them when they were children, and that data is really important. The Australian Child Maltreatment Study, for example, provided a representative survey of 8,000 Australians, and what it tells us is between 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 Australians has experienced some form of child sexual abuse before the age of 18. It tells us who offended against them. It tells us some of the scenarios that they experienced of abuse, and also what their outcomes and what their needs are. So that's incredibly important data. But what we know about perpetrators of child sexual abuse is somewhat limited. We know what victims and survivors tell us, which is really important, but often what victims are reporting, bearing in mind that most perpetrators are never caught or detected. So most perpetrators of child sexual abuse get away with it. And so what victims are telling us that perpetrators are doing, it doesn't match up very well with the data that we're getting from forensic psychologists who are treating perpetrators of child sexual abuse who have been caught and detected, often prosecuted, and then mandated into treatment. So forensic data is really important, and it is really valuable. But in the history of my work, and I do a lot of interview-based research with survivors of severe child sexual abuse, including abuse in the family, whereas when we look at forensic data, there's very little forensic data on incest, for instance, because incest offenders are really difficult to catch. So that just gives you a bit of a backdrop to why we conducted this survey. So going back about 40 or 50 years, we've seen researchers who have surveyed men in the community and asked them about illegal sexual activity. And what we find is that as long as the men know that the survey is anonymous, they're actually quite honest. And so there's been anonymous surveys in relation to child sexual abuse going back to the late 80s. The issue is that those surveys have generally not been very large and they haven't been representative. So that's what we wanted to do. We wanted a representative sample of men. We wanted to be able to say how many perpetrators are in the community, and also what are their characteristics, and that might help us to prevent child sexual abuse before it occurs, intervene early, prosecute more effectively, and support people not to offend. So the project aims to conduct a rigorous analysis of the prevalence of child sexual offending, the attitudes of men towards child abuse, and what are the behavioural and demographic correlates. We initially focused the study on Australia, but we have expanded it out, and we've got 2 data sets in Australia, in the UK and the US, which we'll talk about today. It's very interesting data. So what are the prevalence and who are the offenders? In terms of the methodology, we put the survey together using some validated survey measures, and we also created some of our own, which we then validated through our survey data. We also had a project advisory group that included representatives from police, from the financial sector, from governments, from civil society, people with lived experience, and also mental health support services. And obviously, ethics approval was very important for this project. So how did we get almost 5,000 men to fill this survey out? So we put the survey out through Cloud Research, which is an online survey recruitment platform. It has a pool of about 1.5 million people who fill out surveys for money, small amounts of money, usually between $4 to $6. And so what we did was we asked people to come into the survey, men in particular, and we created some benchmarks against census data in the 3 countries. So roughly we got men coming into the survey who matched the community profile of the three jurisdictions. And then once they came in, once we got the raw data, we did a little bit more statistical magic to make sure that we had a representative sample. We ended up with just under 2,000 men in Australia and 1,500 men in the US and the UK. Before we move on, why did we focus particularly on men? Why didn't we give the survey to men and women? There's a few reasons for that. Firstly, it was financial. We didn't have infinite resources for this study. And given that the majority of people who sexually abuse children are male, it made sense that we would focus on men. And it's important to recognise that child sexual abuse is a form of gender-based violence. It's primarily perpetrated by men and boys, although there is a proportion of women and girls who do engage in sexual abuse. The other point that's important to understand is that women's offending against children is not the mirror image of men's offending against children. And if we were to do a survey on perpetration amongst women, it would probably be a different survey that recognised the different risk factors for women in the sexual abuse of children. So key survey questions, we asked about demographics. So what's your background? Are you married? How much do you earn? What's your qualifications? And so on. We asked about people's internet use. We asked about their health and well-being, including adverse childhood experiences. We asked about attitudes to children and attitudes to technology-facilitated child sexual abuse. We asked about pornography and access to child sexual abuse material. We then asked about sexual feelings towards children, and then online and offline behaviours, sexual behaviours towards children. We had attention and honesty checks throughout the survey. So Cloud Research has some quality control indicators when they recruit people to their survey pool, making sure that people are not signing up and then just speeding through a survey for the money. We also had our own attention checks. So we had a number of points in the survey that said, you need to answer blue to this question. What is your favorite color? And then listed some colors. And if you didn't tick blue, then you were ejected from the survey. And there was also an honesty check at the end of the survey that just said, how honest were you filling out your responses? And if people didn't say they were 100% honest, then we also kicked them out of the survey. And 18 was the standard age of consent across all countries and all offences. So because it was a multi-jurisdictional study, and in fact, in Australia, the age of consent varies between 16 to 17 for contact sexual abuse. But in the United States, it actually varies between 16 to 18. And there's also variance between the 3 jurisdictions in age of consent for online offences. I'll also note that we were asking people to tell us what they'd ever done in the course of their life. And just in Australia, the age of consent has varied for some sexual acts between 16 to 21 over the last 50 years. So we used 18 as the standard age of consent. So some limitations. Our recruitment relied on convenience sampling, and it was a non-probability strategy. So we were reliant on the pool of people that Cloud Research had already recruited. Best case survey methodology is that we would be using a method that would go out to the Australian community, and anyone in the Australian community would have an equal opportunity or chance to participate in the study. That's the best way to do a survey. The problem is there's no way to do that online. And there's no way to do it anymore through the phone. Most people don't have a phone. And also what we know from prior research is even with anonymous surveys, for understandable reasons, people don't admit to sexually abusing children when they're speaking to someone over the phone. We do have in Australia one very high quality probability sample for research, but we actually couldn't afford to access them. We just didn't have the money. So this was our best way forward. There's always a risk, as I mentioned, of cheaters or speeders in these sorts of online survey panels where people are just moving very quickly through the survey to get the money at the end. As I said, Cloud Research has quality control built in, but so did we. And we could also see how quickly people filled the survey out. And we could reject people on the basis that they were too quick in filling out the survey. 18 years as the age of consent across all offence categories. We have had some individuals who have claimed that our data must be biased on this basis. So, for example, a 19-year-old man who had a sexual encounter with a 17-year-old. It is a risk in our study that a person could report that, and that would potentially inflate our figures. But we have quite a high level of confidence that we're not exaggerating levels of contact offending. The reason for that is it was incredibly rare that there was a young person, and by young, I mean under the age of 50, who reported any contact offending against a child who did not also report online offending. Almost all of the men in our sample who were offending offline, contact offending, were also offending online. The only men who were only contact offenders were over the age of 65 and didn't know how to use the internet. And that's the only reason why they weren't offending online, is because they didn't know how to, frankly. And also the risk of contact offending in our data was in line with other studies. So we're quite confident in this. Nonetheless, we are currently looking for funding to do more testing on the survey instrument and starting to roll this study out across different countries, different languages, and also looking at how we might be able to roll the survey out in middle and low income countries, which is really exciting. So when it comes to, really sensitive, difficult topics like the sexual abuse of children, you need to ask the same questions in a number of different ways. So we asked people if they had sexual feelings towards people below the age of 18, but we also gave some hypothetical scenarios where we said, would you have sexual contact with a child between these particular age ranges if you knew that you wouldn't be caught? So 12 to 14, 10 to 12, and then under the age of 10. We asked if people had any concerns about their sexual feelings towards young people. We also gave people a slider and we said, what's the lowest age that you usually find attractive? And it could be as young or as old as they wanted. And so people could take that slider under the age of 18. We asked 5 questions relevant to whether people had sexually offended against children. So have you ever knowingly and deliberately viewed pornographic material containing people below the age of 18? Have you ever flirted or had sexual conversations with a person below the age of 18 online? Have you webcammed in a sexual way with a person below the age of 18? Paid for any online sexual interactions, images, or videos involving a person below the age of 18? Or have you had sex or sexual contact with a person below the age of 18? So what I'm going to say is that none of the data that we are presenting is about sexually harmful behaviour committed by people under the age of 18. Everything that I'm reporting is what men said that they did when they were over the age of 18, pursuant to people under the age of 18. So that's really an important qualification. So let's get into the data. We created 4 categories of men. So we had men who had no sexual feelings and had not offended against children. That's the majority of men in the community, but that group of men is not as large as we might want. So men with no sexual feelings who have never offended against children, that's 80% of men in Australia. What that means is that 20% of men in Australia have some version of either sexual offending against children and or sexual feelings towards children. So what you see here is 10% of men in Australia have sexual feelings towards children, but have not acted on it. And that's roughly the same in the US, slightly lower in the UK, although that difference was not statistically significant. We then have a group that's quite consistent across the 3 jurisdictions who are reporting, and I'm sorry, this says sexual contact, it should say sexual offending. This is any sexual offending, online or offline. So sexual offending against children, somewhere between 4 to 5% of men, about 1 in 20 men, but they don't report any sexual feelings. Now, I've long had clinical colleagues who have said to me that there are times where they are treating men who have been detected for sexually abusing children, but these men don't appear to have any sexual interest in children. I will say that I was pretty skeptical of that, but this has come out in our data, and we'll look at these categories in more detail in a moment. There's then a group of men who have sexual feelings towards children and they are acting on those sexual feelings. They're offending. So that's about 5% of men in Australia and the UK. It is much higher in the United States. And something that we're going to pick up on today is why is sexual offending higher in the United States compared to the other two jurisdictions? Because it is much higher. Because that is going to help us to understand what are these social determinants of child sexual abuse, basically. What are some of the opportunities that we have available if we can learn from this survey to reduce the overall rate of sexual offending against children? So let's talk about this group of men. We've conducted a statistical analysis comparing these three categories of men here to men in the community with no sexual feelings and no offending against children. And we will be publishing the results of this analysis. So men with sexual feelings only who haven't acted on it, compared to other men in the community, they were more likely to be young, they were younger men, they lived in urban areas, they had lower incomes. Now, younger men generally have lower incomes than older men, so we might expect to see that. They do have a history of child sexual abuse. They're more likely to have a history of child sexual abuse. There's some substance abuse issues. Look, potentially that's more common in younger men, possibly. They endorse denial of abusiveness attitudes. So this group of men were much more likely to deny that sexual abuse was harmful. And that's probably the most common cognitive distortion that we see amongst child sex offenders or amongst men who want to abuse children. What I will also say is that when we compare men with sexual feelings who haven't offended to men with sexual feelings who have, there's another really important attitudinal difference between those two groups of men. These men had much higher scores of what we call blame diffusion. So we had questions in our survey that said, look, maybe you're less at fault for abusing children if you drink too much. Or maybe men look at child sexual abuse material because they're stressed. Or maybe they look at child sexual abuse material because they were abused and, it's therapeutic for them. So we asked these sorts of questions. And the men who had feelings towards children who weren't offending were much more likely to engage in blame diffusion than men with sexual feelings who were offending. And I think one of the things this suggests to us is that this is a group of men who want to abuse children, but they are grappling with the moral implications of that. And they're grappling with questions of responsibility. If I do act on my urges, who's at fault? And to a certain respect, they're looking to attribute the blame for what they want to do somewhere else. Once these men start offending, the blame diffusion just disappeared in our survey. And what we saw very strongly for men who are offending against children is they don't believe that what they're doing is wrong. These men evinced higher levels of psychological distress, so particularly depression and anxiety. Now, this group of men was also, compared to men who go on to offend, these men were actually younger on average than men who are offending. So it does suggest to us that these men may be sort of pre-offenders. This is the group of men we need to reach to prevent onset of child sexual abuse. So men who have offended but don't appear to have any sexual feelings towards children, compared to other men in the community, they had some characteristics. They were more likely to be older, they had a child in the household, they were more likely to consume deviant pornography, so particularly violent pornography or pornography with animals. They had a higher history of family mental illness, more likely to say that a family member had been incarcerated. They had higher rates of anxiety and depression in a brief score that we gave them. And they also denied that child sexual abuse was harmful. What I will say is that these men, statistically, they were the least distinguishable from men in the community. So they weren't actually statistically very different from the rest of the community sample. So it suggests that they're not markedly different from other men in the community. In a certain respect, I think that this is good news, because what it suggests to me, at least, is that these men's sexual offending against children is not driven by particular sexual interest, but instead by an intersecting risk factors. And it might be adverse childhood experiences, plus some substance abuse, plus some overall antisociality. It may be that they're offending for opportunistic reasons. So this is not a small group of men. This was about 4% of men in Australia. And it suggests to me, there's a real prevention window here for these men, in terms of if we tighten up child safeguarding, child protection, if we make offending against children more difficult, these men are much less likely then to offend, because they're not preferential offenders. Now, this was a group of men who were very concerning to us. They were the most homogenous group. So when we looked at the characteristics that these men had in common, the statistical model had a very high level of coherence. And so to a certain extent, we're looking at sort of a profile of men. So compared to other men in the community, these men had sexual feelings. They wanted to abuse children, and they were. They were married or living with a partner, primarily a female partner. They were much more likely to be working with children than other men in the community. They had a history of child sexual abuse and neglect. They were more depressed and more anxious. They did not believe that child sexual abuse was harmful. They watched a lot of deviant pornography, so violence and bestiality. This group of men in Australia were 27 times more likely to view animal pornography than everyone else, basically. In fact, in our data, 50% of men who access animal pornography are also sexually abusing children. And that's actually quite important. If you look at prosecutions for men who sexually abuse animals, the majority of those men are also child sex offenders. They used privacy software. So they are very engaged online in online child abuse, but they're using encrypted services, they're using VPNs. So they're quite actively hiding what they're doing online. They're also frequenting romance websites and dating apps. There was a study put out by the Australian Institute of Criminology last year, I believe. It was a sample of 3,000 Australians who use dating apps. And what they found was that 10% of that sample had been asked for a photo of their child by a stranger, and 5% of those 3,000 people had been asked for a naked or a sexual photo of their child by a stranger. So we know that child sex offenders are using dating apps in order to access single parents, in order to access their children. And this group of men was, even though they're more likely to be married, were also more likely to be using dating apps than other men in the community. So I think we've got some pretty big questions about why these men are using dating apps and what they're using it for. They also had some substance abuse issues as well. So Sam Nicol and colleagues in Queensland have recently published some really important studies looking at men who offended against children for 10 years or more without being detected. And these men were eventually detected and prosecuted. And what Sam and colleagues found was that these men were superficially pro-social. They had a good reputation. They were often married. They had white-collar jobs. They were working with children. And that's why nobody suspected them or detected them. That's why nobody believed the allegation when it was made. So these men are very good at covering their tracks. And effectively, this group of men is specifically pursuing a kind of a double life, where they are superficially very respectable, and then behind the scenes, actually their sexuality, their sexual practice and behavior is really deviant and quite illegal. And not only are they abusing children, but they have other deviant sexual interests as well. And I think this is quite important to observe. We have seen claims being made from forensic psychologists that a sexual interest in children is normative, that it's just a sexual orientation like any other. It's an unfortunate sexual orientation, but I've come across multiple times criminologists and psychologists claiming that there's no difference between men who are sexually interested in children and other men in the community. The only difference that they have is that they're sexually interested in children. That is not true in our data. It's also not true that these men were only sexually interested in children. They had a much broader set of sexual interests. And I will say for this category of men, even though they're more likely to be married, they are statistically more likely to identify as heterosexual than the rest of men in the community. These men were actually more likely to report that they'd had sexual partners of both genders. And this isn't about these men being bisexual. It just goes to my point about these men are actually quite sexually indiscriminate in their proclivities. So let's get down to the prevalence of child sexual abuse amongst men across the 3 jurisdictions. You can see that really stark difference in any child sexual abuse between the United States and Australia and the UK. And that really holds up for all of our measures. So just over 3% of men in Australia reported that over the age of 18, they had sexual contact with someone under the age of 18. In the US, it was double. Around 4% of men in Australia and the UK admitted to grooming a child online. In the US, that was about 6%. Somewhere between 2.5% and 3% of men in Australia and the UK said that they had intentionally viewed child sexual abuse material. So intentionally and deliberately over the age of 18, it was double in the US. This figure is almost certainly an underestimation because we had in the Australian data, 4.2% of men said that they had viewed pornographic material involving children when they were under the age of 18. Now, we've excluded that from the analysis because arguably it could include sexting. It could include intimate images sent to them when they were 14 by another 14-year-old. However, what we also know is that child sex offenders, the majority who view child sexual abuse material begin doing that when they are teenagers, when they're under the age of consent. So I think that this figure here is almost certainly an underestimation. And when we run this data again, we will actually change the design of that question. Have you ever engaged in a sexually explicit webcam with a child? Just under 2% of men in Australia, but double that in the US. And have you ever paid for sexual content involving children? Again, about 2% in Australia and the UK, and more than double in the United States. So why are we seeing these differences? So this is a statistically significant difference in the US compared to Australia and the UK. The magnitude was greatest for paying for online sexual interactions, images or videos, engaging in sexually explicit webcam interaction with the child, and deliberately viewing child sexual abuse material. What we will also see in a moment is that US men report being approached online by a child offering sexual services at much higher rates than the other 2 jurisdictions. So US men are much more likely to have a child, or at least they said to us, have a child come forward and offer them an online opportunity to abuse them. So this is something that we need to do a lot more work on. And through Childlight, we're doing some more work on this globally. But we did a multivariate analysis to look at what factors explain the difference between the US and the other 2 jurisdictions. So much higher rates of child sexual abuse, neglect, and family incarceration in the US. So it's primarily adverse childhood experiences, but also in the US, more frequent internet use. So I want to take a bit of time just to unpack these 2 questions. So what's the role of adverse childhood experiences in increasing the prevalence of child sex offending? And then this issue around the internet. Because what we know in the United States is that their online environment is much less regulated than in Australia or the UK. And what it suggests, at least to me, is that the ways in which the government regulates the internet and manages online content has a direct effect on the prevalence of offending against children. So we're just going to look at those two factors. So adverse childhood experiences is not it's a concept that emerges in the late 80s. It was a survey instrument actually developed by an insurance company in the US, and it looks at 10 different forms of childhood adversity. This instrument is not perfect. We used it to give a brief screen for childhood trauma. We didn't have a lot of time in our survey to go into great detail about the men's childhood experiences, but we did want to know about their childhoods. So the adverse childhood experiences, I won't be able to list all 10, but it's child sexual abuse, child physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, exposure to domestic violence, drug use by a family member, incarceration by a family member. There's a couple of others. Divorce is one of them, which is a very late 80s thing to ask about. Divorce is not predictive of negative outcomes for kids. It's just that divorce may correlate with child abuse or domestic violence. So our data, and you'll see the strength of this association in a moment, suggests that being sexually abused as a child increases the likelihood, and this is for boys. I should say this is really specific for boys. It increases the likelihood of sexual feelings towards children, but not offending. It's actually being sexually abused as a child plus other forms of adversity that increases the likelihood of sexual offending against children. So just in summary, it looks as though child sexual abuse can trigger sexual interest in children in some male victims. And I really want to emphasize this, in some male victims, not all. It's a minority of male victims. But it's additional trauma and adversity that increases the likelihood of acting out against some children. And I think a question that we really have to take seriously is that the male response, the male infant and child response to trauma is not a mirror image of the female response to trauma. And that's linked to a range of factors. And yes, there's social and cultural factors around this, but there's also issues of childhood male neurophysiology. And we see this in other areas of research on adversity. So it is not the case for girls that they follow the same trajectory, but we do see this association with boys. So firstly, if we look at comparison of adverse childhood experiences across the 3 countries, I won't go into this in detail, but what we're seeing is in every respect, we're seeing higher rates of adverse childhood experiences in the United States. And really, we can link that to the fact that the United States for 40 years has disinvested in social supports. You know, underinvestment in public health, underinvestment in public education, underinvestment in the welfare system compared to the other 2 jurisdictions. What that means is that it is harder to be a child on average in the United States. There's more adversity. If your family's in trouble, there's less supports. There's less public infrastructure around you to support that family. And our data suggests that policy setting increases the risk of child sexual abuse because it increases the proportion of men in the community who grow up to be a risk to children. So what you're seeing here is the number of ACEs. As ACEs accumulate, there is basically what we call a dose-dependent relationship. So it is not that adverse childhood experiences is the only explanation for sexual abuse of children. If you look at men who have not sexually abused children in our study, 6-7% of those men report some abuse of children. But what happens is as ACEs increase, the likelihood that a man will sexually abuse a child increases to the point where if a man has 10 adverse childhood experiences, so that's pretty terrible, right? That's emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, low family support, he's been neglected, his parents got divorced, he was exposed to domestic violence, family members were using drugs, family members were mentally ill, family members went to prison. That's a terrible childhood. Then the likelihood that that man sexually abuses a child is over 40%. Now, there's lots of concern here, and I think that that's important about not stigmatizing male trauma survivors. But really, for me, this is not a message about individual survivors. This is a message about governments. How on earth does somebody get to the age of 18 and all 10 of those things have happened to them? The government should have stepped in. Social supports should have stepped in. Welfare, health services should have stepped in. So to my mind, this is a story about government failure. This is not a story about individual men or about male survivors as a group. I want to turn now to this question about internet regulation. So we asked men what they were doing online. This is some of the data about pornography use. So what you're seeing is about 10% of men, a bit more than that, are intentionally viewing pornography involving violence and force. Right? 1 in 10 men is intentionally viewing pornography that either depicts rape or it looks like it depicts rape. Now, just over 4% of men are intentionally or have intentionally viewed animal content, animal pornography. That's much higher in the US. Have you ever been approached by an adult who is selling you sexual content? So who is selling you, their OnlyFans account, for example? It's not uncommon, right? 1 in 5 men has had an adult approach them and offer them that. In Australia, if you use Twitter, for example, Twitter is flooded by bots and this has happened to me, where you make a tweet and then the next 3 replies are people spooking their OnlyFans account. So it's quite common, but it's still higher in the US. Now let's get to the pointy end. Have you ever been approached online by a child who is selling sexual content? That is 1 in 10 men in the US. Okay, it's lower in Australia, but this is, as I mentioned, this is something we really need to dig into. Where is this happening? Do you have a friend who looks at child sexual abuse material? Now, 1.5% of men in Australia said yes. 7.3% of men in the US said yes. Do you have a friend who flirts with children online? 2% of men in Australia, 6.6% of men in Australia. Do you have a friend who is sexually webcamming with children? 1.5% of men in Australia, 5% of men in the US. So a couple of things here. I mean, firstly, it's pointing to that issue around internet regulation, where the online environment in the United States looks very sexualized. It's a space where people can do a lot of deviant things. But also, I think what we're seeing is a lack of a sort of a social consensus in the US that it is socially unacceptable to associate with people who sexually abuse children. Now, I suspect if we looked at this group of men who have friends who are doing these things online, almost certainly those men are also doing the same things online. That then starts to raise questions about things like pedophile rings or online or organized child sexual abuse. Because if 3 or 4 of your friends are also abusing children, well, that raises, as I said, all sorts of questions about the risk that you pose. So, long-standing debates about the relationship between pornography and the sexual abuse of children. Now, one of the things that we know is that men who are sexually interested in children, and I mentioned this earlier, are quite sexually preoccupied. So they look at pornography a lot. And just to be blunt, they masturbate a lot, basically, on average. I've done a lot of interview-based research with women who would go on to discover that their male partner is sexually abusing children, online or offline. And one of the things that most of the women that I interviewed told me is that before they knew that he was abusing children, what they did know was he was watching a lot of pornography. This wasn't just somebody that was logging in for 20 minutes a day. This was somebody who was viewing pornography every day for hours, sometimes 4, 5, 6 hours a day, so very sexually preoccupied. But what we find here is that 5% of men who never look at pornography sexually abuse children, but over 20% of men who daily view pornography sexually abuse children. So that's a big question, right? Is this what's the nature of this relationship? Does it mean that the more that men view pornography, the more it's pornography that makes them a risk to children? Or is it simply that this is an association? Because the more likely somebody is to sexually abuse children, the more sexually preoccupied and hypersexual they are, therefore, the more they look at pornography. We looked at these men's attitudes. We looked at what mediates the association between frequency of pornography and child sex offending. I'm not going to show you all of the analyses, but what we found was that about 3/4, 2/3 of that relationship was mediated by the men's attitudes. So to a certain extent, that's good news. It's not a direct relationship. It's not that viewing pornography causes men to abuse children. What it means is that men that hold attitudes that are conducive to abusing children are both more likely to consume a lot of pornography and also more likely to abuse children. But I've pulled this slide out in particular because what was really the standout and what spoke to the majority of the association was the belief that sexually abusing children doesn't harm children, basically. Now, what we know from content analysis of adult material is that the most common depiction of sexual violence in adult pornography at the moment is not sexual violence against adult women. It's actually incest. So it is adult actors who are role-playing child abuse scenarios, right? Stepmother, stepfather, step-sibling. It's this sort of thing. Now, this is a category of adult pornography that is clearly mimicking child abuse themes and is clearly delivering the message that child sexual abuse is erotic and it is desired and desirable by both parties. Now, this is already pretty horrific for the community, I think. It's pretty horrific for survivors of family-based child sexual abuse. But what it also suggests is that where we have categories of pornography that are reinforcing attitudes that the sexual abuse of children is not harmful, well, then there actually is an argument that pornography consumption may be leading to the sexual abuse of children if pornography contains content that reinforces these attitudes. So this really goes to the point that I've made about internet regulation. I was a big proponent of age verification for adult content, for adult pornography. The Australian government rejected this last year, but did change their mind a couple of months ago under considerable public pressure. And has agreed to institute a trial of age verification technology for adult material, and essentially to legislate for a gateway around adult content. I think that's really important. What we also know from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study is that children today are actually more likely to sexually harm another child than children of previous generations. And I think we have to attribute some or a lot of that to the fact that young people are heavily exposed to pornography while under 18. So I think there's multiple sort of benefits there. So I'm just going to sort of wrap up with a couple of slides. So what are the pathways to offending according to our survey of almost 5,000 men around the world? So adverse childhood experiences has a role here, especially sexual abuse. Now, the majority of sexually abused boys do not go on to abuse children. But frankly, sexual abuse in childhood increases men's risks of perpetrating domestic violence. It increases men's risks of adult sexual assault, of sexual assaulting other adults. It increases, frankly, all criminal outcomes and all negative outcomes, all negative mental and physical health outcomes across the board. So I appreciate that particularly for survivors, this can be quite difficult, a difficult conversation, but we really need to be clear that when we protect children from abuse, we are not only protecting them, which is what we should do, but we're also preventing traumatization, which then goes on to have a range of negative effects, including intergenerational effects. Because some boys abused as children will go on to harm when they are adults if they're not supported. And so actually therapeutic services for children really need to be articulated much more strongly into our current approach to the primary prevention of violence against women. I do not think for a moment that we are going to reduce rates of domestic violence, sexual assault, or child sexual abuse if we do not only protect children from violence, but also once they have been exposed to violence, they need and deserve our therapeutic support. And as a country, we do not invest enough in traumatized children. And then we're stuck with social problems like domestic violence, and we are not targeting our public investment in the way that we should to break these intergenerational cycles. And the link between domestic violence and child sexual abuse is a very, very important link that has been neglected to date. There is the facilitating online environment. And so the government has a really important role here in terms of making sure that the online environment is safe. But unfortunately, social media companies just are not doing enough to stop offenders from accessing children. And so we've had big debates. We're having big debates at the moment about age verifying social media. We're having debates about banning smartphones. Now, I don't want to ban smartphones from children, but to be really frank, if if technology companies won't deliver child-safe products, and they have had 25 years to do that, then I'm not surprised that the government is talking about a smartphone ban. At Childlight, we released the Global Index on Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation a couple of weeks ago, and based on a meta-analysis of 85 studies, we found that 1 in 8 children around the world, that's 300 million children, has experienced online sexual harm in the last 12 months. That's just completely unacceptable. And all of the blame for that abuse is not only in the laps of perpetrators, but it's in the laps of commercial service providers who are facilitating that abuse on an extraordinary scale. In terms of offenders abusing children, there's a long-standing debate in the literature around online offenders and offline offenders. And there's often been a view that men who abuse children online are categorically different from men who abuse children offline. That is not evident in our data at all. What we've found is that men who are contact-only offenders, as I mentioned earlier, are just much older, over the age of 65, and they don't know how to use the internet. That's the only reason why they're not offending online. Our young men who are engaged, frankly, the rest of the cohort who is abusing children, if they are abusing children offline, they're also offending online. The other thing that I would say is that when we looked at men who were offending online, and we looked at that data, that question where we asked them, if you could abuse a child offline, would you? Men who are offending online were 2 to 3 times more likely than men in the community to say that they would abuse a child offline if they knew that nobody would find out. So what we really need to understand is that I think maybe 15 or 20 years ago, the idea of a categorical difference between an online offender or an offline offender made sense. We now have 2 generations of offenders who have grown up with the internet. They know how to use it. And if they're sexually interested in children, they are using it. So I think these old categorical differences between online offenders and offline offenders, we really need to trouble that. When we look at the available data, men who are abusing children online but not offline are often men who are just less sexually attracted to children. So they are sexually attracted to kids, but less so, and probably have some more internal barriers to acting on that interest. But I think that this is a space that we really need to rethink. They often appear to be of good character, particularly men with sexual feelings who are offending against children. And they are using this appearance of good character in order to access children. And that has a range of implications, including for sentencing, because historically we use good character evidence to mitigate sentencing, to say, oh, look, he's done a bad thing, but he's a good guy. but being a good guy is how these offenders commit their offense. So this is a really important debate for us. They're viewing lots of pornography, but particularly violent and deviant pornography, including things like animal content. And there's attitudinal issues here, particularly the belief that sexual abuse is harmless. I've just started sort of playing around with this model in terms of a biopsychosocial model of child sex offending, thinking about the way that childhood adversity can trigger an underlying vulnerability to a sexual disorder or sexual dysregulation. And for me, looking at my data, sexual dysregulation has been a useful concept to think about how adverse childhood experiences negatively impacts on sexual development. There's also psychological aspects to the offending, including holding abuse supportive beliefs, lacking empathy for victims and children. And what we know is that men who endorse myths around child sexual abuse, men who hold abuse supportive beliefs, have quite high levels of misogyny and male entitlement. And that's clear elsewhere in the literature. At a social level, when we think about public policy, we clearly need to situate child sex offending within broader models of gender inequality. We need to think about adverse childhood experiences, the relationship to violence against women, but also an unregulated private sector, particularly the technology sector, who's been allowed to deliver services that harm children and facilitate offending now for a quarter century. And also the issue, and we really see this acutely in the United States, around a lack of government investment in health and welfare, and frankly, a lack of government investment in children, full stop. So what does this all mean? So child sexual abuse has social and political determinants. It's not simply that some men are born to abuse children. What we do at the policy and practice level clearly impacts on the risk of offending against children. The sexual abuse of children appears to be linked to sexual and behavioural dysregulation caused by the interaction of childhood adversity, social and cultural conditions, and particular underlying vulnerabilities for male children, but not female children necessarily. Not all people subject to these conditions will go on to abuse children. We are talking about probabilities here, but these conditions increase the proportion of men in the community who are risk to children. Child sexual abuse is partly driven by political decisions. Are we going to invest in children or not? Are we going to prevent violence against women or not? Are we going to regulate powerful industries or not? But there's also a really important cultural component regarding norms and attitudes to children, gender, and sexuality that just has not been tackled as a public policy priority. So this is my last slide. Again, just something that I've been adding to over time in terms of a prevention agenda. At the level of primary prevention, if we want to drop the level of offending against children, we need to reduce all adverse childhood experiences. We need to target those attitudes that are conducive to the abuse of children. And frankly, governments have been really reluctant to do that. The national campaign around child sexual abuse prevention is about having a conversation with a child about the possibility of abuse. And yet when you look at campaigns to prevent violence against women, the government's been quite happy to target attitudes that are conducive to violence against women, but for some reasons quite reluctant to target attitudes that are conducive to the abuse of children. We need to regulate encryption and offenders' access to encrypted services. We need to regulate pornography, and we need safety by design. We need technology platforms that are safe for children. In terms of early intervention, we know that these offenders are more likely to work with children than other men. So at the institutional level, we need to embed child protection. We need to intervene early when boys have been traumatized. We need to provide them with therapeutic support. As I mentioned, 50% of men who are viewing animal content are also offending against children. So we actually need to target deviant pornography consumption and think about getting men and boys who are looking at that material into a support service, such as a service for people concerned for their sexual feelings and behavior towards kids. And so we have the pilot program, Stop It Now, under Jesuit Social Services, and hopefully we'll see that service expand. In terms of intervention and prosecution, we should expect that offenders look respectable. We need to understand that many of these offenders are quite premeditated and then networking with one another. Many offenders are living with children, also working with children. Some of what they do has a financial footprint and will be showing up through their financial records. So there's quite an important role here for the finance sector in detecting particularly online child sexual abuse. And I think there's also a number of implications for treatment, but I'll leave that for my forensic colleagues.
Thank you for attending this webinar. Please feel free to share our resources and let us know if you have any feedback. If you would like to learn more about our program, visit projectparadigm.com.au and be sure to tune in to the next webinar.